the year 1600. A British fleet approaches the waters near the Visayas. Seasoned captains, cannons loaded, the full weight of an empire behind them. And they turned around. Not because of a storm, not because of disease, because of what they saw on the water ahead of them. That story has been buried under 4 centuries of colonial narratives. The ships that caused that retreat were not warships. They were trading vessels. And the men who sailed them had spent generations perfecting a system of maritime warfare that European naval doctrine had simply never encountered before. Here is the conclusion before the evidence. Ancient Filipino maritime culture was not primitive. It was a sophisticated, armed, and fiercely independent commercial network that colonial powers found genuinely difficult to dominate. The weapons were not anomalies. They were architecture. Well built into the ships themselves, carried as standard equipment, and deployed by traders who were also by necessity warriors. All right, that detail, the seamless identity of merchant and fighter, is what the British encountered in 1600, and it is the detail that almost nobody talks about. To understand why Filipino trade ships carried weapons, you have to start with the geography. The Philippine archipelago is not one place. It is over 7,000 islands. No single road, no central army, no walls to hide behind. The sea was everything. The road, the marketplace, the border, and the battlefield, all at once. Communities separated by water developed their own power structures. Precisely structures. The Datu class, the chieftain leaders, maintained authority through 2 things: trade relationships and the capacity for force. These were not separate functions. They were the same function. A Datu who could not protect his trade routes had no trade routes. A Datu with no trade had no power, so the ships carried both goods and the means to defend them. Well, this was not unusual in Southeast Asia, but the Filipino version had a particular engineering logic that set it apart. Really apart. The primary vessel type that concerns us is the Karakoa. Long, shallow-drafted, extraordinarily fast. European ships of the same era were deep-hulled, heavy, and optimized for Atlantic conditions. The Karakoa was built for the island sea, able to navigate shallow reefs, turn sharply, and accelerate in short bursts. A European galleon trying to chase a Karakoa fleet in Philippine waters was like a freight truck trying to follow a motorcycle through a market. Speed is a weapon. This point gets underestimated. By the way, the Karakoa carried swivel guns called lantaka. These were bronze cannons, small and maneuverable, mounted along the sides and bow. Philippine smiths had been casting bronze for generations. The metallurgical tradition here predates European contact by centuries. The lantaka was not a copy of European technology. It was a parallel development, smaller, lighter, and designed for the specific tactical reality of island warfare. A European cannon required a fixed position and a large crew. The lantaka could be repositioned mid-battle by a single person. That flexibility changed the entire geometry of a naval engagement. Now add the lamellar construction of the hull. Filipino shipbuilders used a technique called lashed lug construction, where planks were stitched together with rattan rather than nailed. This created a hull that flexed rather than cracked under stress. European ships nailed together would splinter under impact. A Filipino trade vessel would absorb the same force and hold shape. This was not weakness. This was engineering intelligence that European shipwrights would not rediscover until modern composite materials theory. Interesting fact. The fleet that the British encountered in 1600 operated near what Portuguese and Spanish records describe as the domain of Moro maritime confederacies in the Visayan and Sulu regions. The specific engagement is documented in fragmentary British East India Company records from that period. Not celebrated, not detailed, but present. A notation that contact was made, that resistance was encountered, and that the fleet withdrew to reassess. Why fragmentary? because retreating from traders is not a story empires tell about themselves. What the records do preserve is enough to reconstruct the tactical picture. The British ships were larger, they had more total firepower on paper. What they did not have was maneuverability in the local waters, local knowledge of the reefs, or any experience fighting an enemy that attacked from multiple low-profile vessels simultaneously. Important. The Karakoa fleet used a technique that modern analysts would recognize as swarm tactics. Many small vessels. Multiple attack vectors. No single point of vulnerability. To destroy the threat, you had to destroy every boat. And every boat was fast. This is where the merchant warrior identity becomes tactically significant. Now pay attention. The crews of these ships were not soldiers pulled from barracks. They were sailors who had been fighting from boats their entire lives. Reaction time in a naval engagement is measured in seconds. A professional crew that eats, sleeps, and navigates together does not need orders for every action. They read the water, the wind, and the enemy simultaneously. That kind of cohesion cannot be manufactured quickly. British naval crews in 1600 were experienced. But their experience was Atlantic, deep water, predictable wind patterns, engagements between large vessels at cannon range. Philippine waters required a completely different cognitive map. Think about it. The decision to withdraw was rational, not shameful. The commanding officer looked at the tactical situation. Shallow reefs ahead, fast enemy vessels with unknown range and numbers, no local intelligence, and supply lines stretched thin. And made the only sensible call. Truly sensible. Come back with better information. They did not come back with better information. They moved on to other territories. That choice shaped 4 centuries of regional history. There's a catch. The Spanish, who had already established Manila by 1571, spent enormous resources attempting to suppress what they called the Moro raids, which were, from the other side, the defense of existing trade networks against colonial disruption. The campaigns were repeated. The results were inconclusive. The Spanish built forts, the maritime confederacies adapted, the Lantaca kept firing. One detail from Spanish colonial records deserves specific attention. Commanders repeatedly noted that the enemy vessels carried enough weapons to equip a European garrison. This was not the armament of desperate defense. This was the standard equipment of a professional commercial operation in a contested maritime environment. Think about what that means structurally. A Philippine trade ship of the 16th and 17th centuries was not primarily a weapon of war. It was a floating economic unit that happened to be fully armed. The weapons were not cargo, the weapons were infrastructure. European trading companies of the same era, like the East India Company, the VOC, built their commercial power on military capacity. The Philippine model predated that approach by centuries and arrived at it through a completely different logic. Not corporate monopoly backed by state violence. Community-level sovereignty expressed through armed trade. The distinction matters. One model uses weapons to take markets, the other uses weapons to keep them. By the 18th century, the Lantaca had spread throughout maritime Southeast Asia. Filipino, Malay, and Brunei smiths traded and copied the design. Spanish records note with frustration that confiscating weapons from one community simply meant that community acquired new ones from a neighbor. The technology was distributed. There was no single forge to destroy, no single supply chain to cut. That is systems resilience. The weapon survived because the culture that produced it was networked, not hierarchical. Let's say colonial historiography spent considerable effort reframing this maritime culture as piracy. The label mattered politically. Piracy is criminal. Trade is legitimate. If you can reclassify an independent merchant fleet as a pirate network, you transform the suppression of a competitor into law enforcement. The archives from Manila, Seville, and London from this period use the word pirate with suspicious consistency whenever they describe Filipino maritime actors who refuse to pay tribute or submit to colonial trade terms. The definition shifted depending on compliance, not behavior. By the way, that semantic game is one reason the real story stayed buried, but there's a detail. The ships, the weapons, the men who sailed them, they built one of the most sophisticated maritime commercial systems in the pre-colonial world. Without a European patron, without institutional backing, without the infrastructure of empire, they built it because the geography demanded it, and because the people who lived on that geography were competent enough to answer the demand. There's a catch. The British retreat of 1600 was not a footnote. It was evidence. Evidence that before the colonial narrative began its long work of simplification, there were Filipino sailors on ancient trade routes, carrying bronze cannons they had cast themselves, on ships they had designed for waters they had sailed for generations, who looked at a British fleet and did not blink. Wait a second. The sea remembers differently than the archives do? Every